Somewhere along the humid bayous of southern Louisiana, in the punishing summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds, not from yellow fever, not from consumption. Each one had his throat opened with surgical precision while he slept. Bodies discovered at dawn, their faces frozen somewhere between ecstasy and terror. All 11 were prominent members of the Knights of the White Camellia, the most feared Klan chapter in the entire region. Local authorities documented the deaths as unrelated incidents scattered across 4 parishes, filing reports that directly contradicted witness accounts and physical evidence. The case was quietly closed within 6 months, all records sealed by order of the parish judge. But in the tight quarters of the colored sections, in the back rooms of freedmen's churches, another story traveled, one passed in whispers for generations, never put to paper, never spoken where white ears might catch it. Tonight, on Black Rite Stories, that story finally gets told. Before we go deeper into the tale of the woman they called Lave Noire, a story that powerful men wanted erased, I need you to do something. Tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? I want to know where our community is tuning in as these buried histories come back to life. The story doesn't begin in 1872. It begins 4 years earlier, in the smoldering ruins of a war that had supposedly ended. St. Martin Parish in 1868 was a wound that refused to close. The grand plantations that had once churned out sugar and cotton by the ton now stood like rotting teeth against the Louisiana sky, their fields surrendering back to swamp, their manor houses occupied by federal troops or left to crumble under the weight of their own collapsed glory. The town of Breaux Bridge served as the parish seat, a cluster of weathered buildings gathered around a courthouse that had changed flags 3 times in 7 years. The population had shifted in ways that horrified the old planter class. Nearly 4,000 formerly enslaved people now walked freely through streets where they had once been forbidden even to make eye contact with white residents. Some of them owned property. They voted, shielded by the presence of Union soldiers and the Freedmen's Bureau. They testified in courts of law against white defendants, an inversion so profound that many longtime white residents spoke of it as a kind of apocalypse, the end of civilization itself. In response, the Knights of the White Camellia had risen from the wreckage of Confederate veteran societies and local militias. Unlike their more notorious counterparts in other states, the Louisiana Knights prided themselves on a certain refinement. They wore no hoods, they burned no crosses. They were lawyers, merchants, former officers, plantation owners scrambling to salvage what remained of their empires. They controlled the local courts, the sheriff's office, the parish council. They didn't need theatrics. They had power. Their methods were precise. A freedman who spoke too boldly in town might find his crops destroyed, his mule crippled, his credit at the general store suddenly revoked. A colored man who tried to register to vote might receive a late-night visit from well-dressed gentlemen who explained, quite reasonably, why he ought to reconsider. Violence was reserved for those who proved stubborn, and even then it was calculated, designed to send a message without drawing federal intervention. The Knights convened every Thursday evening in a back room of the Breaux Bridge Hotel, a 3-story establishment on Main Street owned by Harold Jessup, one of their founding members. 11 men made up the inner circle, the decision-makers who determined which freedmen needed reminding of their place, which white Republicans needed to be encouraged to leave the parish, which federal sympathizers required more aggressive persuasion. Into this powder keg walked a woman who called herself Celeste Dufresne. She appeared in Breaux Bridge on a Tuesday morning in late April, stepping off the steamboat from New Orleans with a single trunk and a parasol of black silk. She appeared to be around 30 years old, though her face held a quality that made age difficult to pin down. Not young, not old, but somehow existing outside the normal passage of years. Her complexion was the shade of café au lait, that ambiguous tone that in Louisiana could mean anything from Creole aristocracy to mixed ancestry of a dozen different origins. She wore mourning clothes of expensive cut, the kind of garments that demanded a skilled seamstress and fine fabric, suggesting both means and standing. She took a room at the Bro Bridge Hotel, paying a full month in advance with gold coins counted out one by one onto Harold Jessup's front desk. Her French was flawless, her English spoken with a Parisian accent that fascinated the locals. She claimed to be the widow of a French merchant who had perished in New Orleans during the yellow fever outbreak the previous summer. She was, she said, looking to purchase property in the parish, perhaps a small house with land where she might live quietly, away from the disease and disorder of the city. The story was believable enough. New Orleans had indeed suffered a devastating epidemic. French merchants did business throughout Louisiana. Well-bred Creole widows did seek refuge in smaller communities. And there was something about Celeste Dufresne that discouraged close questioning, a dignity, a self-possession that made clear 7 pieces. He was accustomed to being treated with respect. She attended Mass at St. Bernard Catholic Church every Sunday morning, sitting in the section reserved for Creole families of standing. She took her meals in the hotel dining room, always alone, reading French novels or composing letters in a neat, precise hand. She walked through town in the afternoons, parasol casting shade across her face, nodding politely to those she passed, but initiating no conversations. She seemed to have no interest in the racial tensions consuming the parish, no political opinions, no connections to the freedmen's community or the federal authorities. She appeared, on all counts, to be exactly what she claimed, a respectable woman in difficult circumstances. Within 2 weeks, she had drawn the attention of every man on the Knights' Council. It began simply enough. Thomas Broussard, who owned 1,500 acres of struggling cotton fields east of town, encountered her outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon. She was examining a bolt of fabric, her gloved hands moving over the material with a practiced touch. He offered his assistance. He knew the merchant, he said, and could ensure she received a fair price. She smiled at him, a smile that seemed to hold both gratitude and faint amusement, as though she found his chivalry charming but unnecessary. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, during which she mentioned her difficulty finding suitable property, her unfamiliarity with the region, her dependence on the generosity of strangers during this hard season of grief. Broussard found himself thinking about her for the rest of that day. There was something magnetic about her, a quality he couldn't name precisely. It wasn't merely beauty, though she was undeniably striking. It was a quality of attention, as if when she looked at you, you became the only person in the world who mattered. Ed, when her fingers briefly touched his arm while thanking him, he felt the contact like a current running through him. He began manufacturing reasons to be in the hotel lobby when she passed through. He offered to show her properties that might suit her needs. She accepted with a modesty that acknowledged both his generosity and her own vulnerable position as a woman alone in an unfamiliar place. They rode out to several parcels over the following days, always with others nearby, always returning before sunset. Broussard told his wife these were potential business dealings, that he was simply assisting a respectable widow, as any Christian gentleman would. But he thought about Celeste constantly, the way candlelight caught the curve of her neck, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her clothes, the way her eyes met his sometimes with an expression that seemed to see straight through his careful respectability to something raw and starving underneath. The other knights noticed Broussard's distraction, and gradually several of them began cultivating their own acquaintance with Madame Dufresne. Antoine Lalère, a lawyer who had defended multiple Klan members in federal court, offered his legal services should she need assistance with property transfers. Dr. Raymond Haber, who served as parish coroner, expressed concern about her health, the strain of widowhood, the change in climate, and suggested she might benefit from a consultation. Eugène Fontenot, who ran the largest dry goods operation in the parish, extended a generous line of credit for any household items she might require once she found her home. Celeste accepted each overture with the same gracious reserve, never appearing to encourage attention, yet somehow making each man feel he alone truly understood her situation, that he alone could provide what she needed. She was, they assured themselves, a respectable woman in hard circumstances. Their interest was purely chivalrous. The fact that she occupied their thoughts, that they invented reasons to visit the hotel, that they found themselves drawing comparisons between her refined manner and their wives' provincial ways, these were simply natural responses to an exceptional woman. By June, the dynamic within the night's Thursday meetings had shifted in ways too subtle to name directly. The 11 men who had always operated with military precision now engaged in small rivalries, quiet competitions for status and standing. Broussard mentioned his afternoon drives with Madame Dufresne. Lalère countered with his legal consultations. Hebert spoke of her delicate constitution, her need for a physician's regular attention. The others, Jessup, the hotel owner, Marcos de Bordeaux, who controlled the parish newspaper, Judge Vincent Théotou, who commanded the local courts, Sheriff Claude Devereux, banker Philippe Rousseau, plantation owners William Duplantis and Charles Arsenault, each found their own way to establish a connection with the fascinating widow. None of them noticed that Celeste had never actually purchased any property. None of them questioned why a woman supposedly fleeing New Orleans would choose Breaux Bridge, a violent backwater torn apart by racial conflict. None of them wondered why a grieving widow seemed so remarkably composed, never weeping, never speaking of her late husband, except in the vaguest of terms. And none of them knew that late each night, after the hotel fell quiet, Celeste Dufresne sat at the small desk in her room and added entries to a leather-bound journal, recording each man's habits, his vulnerabilities, his secrets, his crimes, recording where he lived, who guarded his property, whether his wife slept soundly, whether he kept weapons near his bed, recording everything she would need when the time came to collect what was owed. Because Celeste Dufresne, if that was even her real name, had not come to Breaux Bridge to purchase property, or to mourn a husband, or to escape yellow fever. She had come for a very specific purpose, one that required patience, meticulous planning, and a willingness to use every weapon available to her. She had come to kill 11 men. The first death occurred on July 19, 1872, during the worst heat wave anyone in St. Martin Parish could remember. Thomas Broussard's body was discovered by his wife at dawn. He lay in their bed inside the plantation house he had inherited from his father. His throat opened from ear to ear with such force that the cut had nearly reached his spine. The sheets beneath him were soaked through with blood, as was the mattress, as was the floor beside the bed. The violence of the wounds stood in sharp contrast to the peace on his face. His eyes were closed, his features relaxed, his hands resting at his sides, as though he had simply drifted off and never returned. Broussard's screams brought the household staff running. Among them was an elderly colored woman named Esther, who had served the family since before the war, first as a slave, now as a paid servant. Years later, in testimony that would never appear in any official record, Esther would describe what she saw when she entered that bedroom. Not just the body, not just the blood, something else, something that made no sense, and that she immediately understood she must never speak of to white authorities. 2 wine glasses sat on the bedside table, both empty. The room carried the scent of lavender and something else, something sweet and organic, she couldn't identify. Mr. Broussard wore only his nightshirt, rucked up around his thighs. The bedclothes were disturbed in a pattern suggesting vigorous activity before death, and though Mrs. Sums Broussard had been sleeping in an adjacent room, she suffered from insomnia and often kept separate quarters to avoid disturbing her husband. There was unmistakable evidence that Broussard had not died alone. Sheriff Devereux arrived within the hour, accompanied by Dr. Hebert. They examined the scene, questioned the servants, and established what would become the official account. Thomas Broussard had been murdered by an intruder, likely a freedman with a grievance, who had crept into the house during the night and cut his throat while he slept. The absence of struggle suggested the killer had been swift and skilled. The fact that nothing was stolen indicated this was personal, not robbery. Perhaps, the sheriff speculated, it was retaliation for one of the many reminders the Knights had delivered to uppity-colored folks in recent months. But Esther, cleaning the room after the body had been removed, found something the white men had overlooked or chosen to ignore. Caught in the floorboards near the bed was a single long hair, dark and lustrous, too fine to belong to Mrs. Enchul, Broussard, and when she stripped the sheets, she found them stained with more than blood. There was other evidence present, evidence of activities that respectable people did not discuss, but that every woman recognized. She said nothing. She burned the sheets as Mrs. Broussard instructed. She swept the floor clean, scrubbed the stains, opened the windows to air out the smell of death and secrets. When the other servants asked what she had seen, she told them only what would keep them safe, that Mr. Safe, Broussard had been killed by an intruder, that the sheriff was investigating, that everyone should be careful not to go out alone after dark. But in the colored section of town, among people who had learned to see what white folks refused to acknowledge, a different story began to circulate. Whispers about the woman who had recently arrived, the beautiful widow who had captured the attention of so many powerful men. About Thomas Broussard's frequent visits to the hotel, the way he had looked at Madame Dufresne, the afternoons he had spent showing her properties he never seemed to mention to his wife, about how convenient it was that a man known for his cruelty to freed people, a man who had personally overseen the whipping of 3 colored men the previous month for the crime of attempting to vote, had been found with his throat cut just days after being seen dining privately with the mysterious Creole widow. The funeral took place on a Saturday, the entire town turning out to pay respects. The Knights attended as a body, standing together near the grave, their faces grim. They were not fools, these men. They recognized that the murder of one of their own was a message, a declaration of war. They assumed it originated from the freedmen's community or from federal sympathizers. They discussed in low voices how to respond, what measures to take, which colored leaders needed to be made examples of. None of them noticed that Celeste Dufresne attended the funeral as well, standing at a respectful distance, veiled in black, head bowed in apparent prayer. None of them saw the small, quiet smile that crossed her lips when she believed no one was watching, and none of them knew that in exactly 3 weeks there would be another funeral. Antoine Lalère died on August 9th, under circumstances eerily similar to Broussard's death. He was found in his bachelor quarters above his law office, throat cut, face peaceful, evidence of female company shortly before his death. This time, the surviving authorities, the sheriff and coroner being Knights themselves, could no longer sustain the fiction of a random intruder. 2 Knights dead in identical fashion within a month pointed to a pattern, a targeted campaign. The whispers in the colored community grew louder. Lavenoir. They called her now the Black Widow, the woman who seduced powerful white men and left them dead in their beds. Some spoke of her with fear, worried that she would draw reprisals down on the entire freedmen's population. Others spoke with a grim, quiet satisfaction, a recognition that justice denied through official channels was being delivered through other means. Because the thing white authorities refused to acknowledge, the thing every colored person in St. Martin Parish understood without being told, was that Celeste Dufresne had not chosen her victims at random. Every man she seduced, every man she killed, each one had real blood on his hands. Thomas Broussard had personally overseen multiple beatings and had burned the cabin of a freedman who filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau. Lalère had defended Klan members in court, by terrorizing colored witnesses, threatening their families, ensuring justice was never delivered. The pattern would hold with every subsequent victim, though white authorities would never make these connections, would never ask why these specific men had been chosen. On August 12th, the remaining 9 Knights held an emergency meeting in the hotel's back room. The Thursday gatherings were no longer adequate. The situation demanded immediate action. They needed to identify the killer. They needed to protect themselves. They needed to restore order before panic spread through the white community. It was Judge Theod who first said aloud what several of them had been thinking, but hadn't dared to voice. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone heavy with reluctance, "we must consider the possibility that the killer is someone we know, someone with access to these men's homes, someone they trusted enough to let down their guard." The room went still, and they all understood the implication. Broussard and Lalère had been killed in their own beds, apparently without struggle, apparently after intimate company. The killer had to be someone they would willingly admit to their private quarters, someone whose presence wouldn't alarm them. "A woman," Dr. Hebert said quietly. "It would have to be a woman." They looked at one another with mounting dread as the pieces assembled themselves. A beautiful woman who had arrived in town recently. A woman who had, one way or another, drawn the attention of every man in that room. A woman whose background, now that they examined it carefully, was strangely thin, supported only by her own testimony and the general plausibility of her story. "Madame Dufresne," Sheriff Devereux said. "God Almighty, it's Madame Dufresne." But even as they reached this conclusion, even as they began discussing how to investigate her, how to establish proof, how to make an arrest without igniting a scandal, they faced a devastating complication. Each of them had spent time alone with her. Each of them had, in ways they hadn't admitted even privately, been drawn in by her. Each of them carried secrets they couldn't afford to expose. Visits to her hotel room, gifts they had given, promises they had made. To investigate her was to investigate themselves, to invite scrutiny none of them could survive. And beneath their fear and fury ran another current, one none of them would name, because even now, even knowing what she might be and what she might have done, several of them couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop recalling the way she had looked at them, touched them, made them feel like men of consequence rather than bitter remnants of a collapsing world. If you're feeling that chill down your spine right now, if you're already wondering how far this goes, you need to hit that like button. Drop your theory in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to Black Rite Stories yet, do it now, because we're about to show you exactly how this game of death played out, and you will not want to miss a word. The investigation into Celeste Dufresne began with careful discretion. Judge Theod used his authority to quietly request information from New Orleans, sending telegrams to police contacts and courthouse clerks, asking about a Creole widow named Dufresne, whose husband had supposedly perished in the yellow fever epidemic. The responses, when they came, were troubling. No merchant named Dufresne had died in New Orleans during the outbreak. No death certificate existed for anyone matching that description. The address Celeste had provided as her New Orleans residence was a boarding house whose owner had no recollection of anyone by that name. It was as though the woman had assembled herself from thin air, her entire past a fabrication. Sheriff Devereux, meanwhile, began quietly questioning hotel staff and local shopkeepers. What he uncovered was the portrait of a woman who was simultaneously present everywhere and traceable nowhere. She kept regular hours, attended church, purchased ordinary household items, but no one could honestly say they knew her. She had no friends, no confidants, no visitors except the various knights who had called on her. Her room was always tidy, her behavior always proper, but there was something about her that left people unsettled in ways they struggled to put into words. The colored servants at the hotel proved more informative, but only when questioned privately, and only when offered genuine assurances of protection. A housemaid named Rachel, reported that Madame Dufresne's room contained almost no personal effects beyond basic necessities. No photographs, no letters, no mementos of a deceased husband, only clothing, toiletries, and a locked trunk she had never seen opened. The room always smelled of lavender, even when Madame wasn't present, as though she had pressed the scent into the walls themselves. More tellingly, Rachel had twice seen Madame Dufresne return to the hotel very late at night, well past midnight, entering through a side door and moving through the hallways like a shadow. On both occasions, she had been carrying what appeared to be a leather medical bag. Though what a widow would want with such items, Rachel couldn't say. While the investigation continued, the Knights reinforced their security. Those with families sent them to relatives in other parishes under the pretense of business matters. Those who lived alone hired guards, former Confederate soldiers who patrolled their properties through the night. They varied their routines, changed their locks, kept loaded pistols within reach at all times. They stopped going out after dark, unless traveling in groups. They treated every sound, every shadow with suspicion. And they waited for the next death, because each of them understood with cold certainty that it was coming. Dr. Raymond Hebert was the third to die. He was found in his medical office on August 27th, his throat cut, his body arranged on his own examination table. The circumstances were nearly identical to the previous murders. Evidence of female company, wine glasses present, that same expression of peace contradicting the violence of his death. But this killing carried something new, something that sent ice through the veins of every surviving Knight. Pinned to Dr. Hebert's chest with a surgical pin was a small piece of paper. On it, written in an elegant hand, were two words, "Remember Baton Rouge." The Knights understood immediately what the message meant, though the authorities and newspapers never would. In March of 1868, Dr. Hebert had traveled to Baton Rouge, to testify at a federal inquiry into Klan violence. A colored woman named Sarah Boudreau had accused several white men, including Knights from St. Martin Parish, of attacking her husband and burning their home. Hebert had testified that Sarah's husband had died, not from injuries inflicted by the attackers, but from pre-existing health conditions, a lie that had helped the accused walk free. 3 months later, Sarah Boudreau was found dead in a New Orleans rooming house, her throat cut. The crime was officially attributed to robbery, though nothing had been taken. The note made clear that Celeste knew about this. More than that, it suggested a personal connection to it, a deep investment in seeing Hebert punished for his role. But how could she know? How could a Creole widow from New Orleans possess such detailed knowledge of Klan operations in Baton Rouge 4 years prior? The answer surfaced from an unexpected place. Judge Theo, working through old newspaper reports and court documents, discovered that Sarah Boudreau had not died alone in the world. She had left behind a daughter, approximately 12 years old at the time, who had disappeared after her mother's murder. No record survived of what became of the girl. She had simply vanished into the chaos of post-war Louisiana, one more displaced child among thousands. The judge brought this information to the next night's meeting, held on a Tuesday night in Jessup's hotel, moved from their usual Thursday schedule in an attempt to break any predictable pattern. He laid out the timeline. Sarah Boudreau murdered in 1868, her daughter gone without a trace. And now, 4 years later, a mysterious woman appears in Bray Bridge and begins systematically killing the men responsible for that murder and for the wider campaign of terror against the freedmen. "She's the daughter," Jessup said, his voice barely above. A whisper. "God Almighty. She's Sarah Boudreau's daughter, come back for all of us." But that theory had problems. Celeste appeared to be in her 30s, far too old to be the girl who had vanished in 1868, unless her entire appearance was a carefully constructed fiction. Her age, her background, her identity, all lies designed to gain access to her targets. Unless she had spent 4 years in deliberate preparation, learning who had been responsible, tracking them to their current lives, shaping herself into exactly the instrument this plan required. The racial implications cut even deeper. If Celeste was Sarah Boudreau's daughter, she was colored. Despite her light complexion and refined bearing, she had passed as Creole, as white enough to move through their society without suspicion. Every man she had seduced had committed what Louisiana law still considered a crime. The scandal alone would ruin them, even if they survived her revenge. "We take her tonight," Sheriff Devereaux said. "Arrest her before she kills again." But Judge Theo shook his head. "On what charge? We have no evidence. Those notes cannot be used without revealing what they reference. Our own investigation is already compromised. We have all been involved with her. Any trial exposes everything." "Then there is no trial," Marcus Thibodeau said quietly. The newspaper editor had been silent until that moment, but his meaning was immediate and clear. The suggestion settled over the room like smoke. They were discussing murder, the extrajudicial killing of a woman who had not been convicted of anything. It was precisely what they had done to countless freedmen across the years. It was what they had done to Sarah Boudreau herself. The irony was not lost on any of them, but fear had long since drowned out whatever remained of their conscience. They voted, as they always did, on consequential Tartars. 9 men remained in the inner circle. 9 hands went up. They would kill Celeste Dufresne before she could kill again. But as they mapped out their plan, not one of them noticed that the hotel's serving girl, a young colored woman named Marie, clearing glasses in the hallway, had heard every word through the meeting room's thin walls. And not one of them saw her slip away into the night, moving swiftly toward the colored section of town, toward a small church where certain people gathered, people who had long understood that survival depended on knowing what white folks were planning before those plans could be set in motion. By dawn, everyone in the freedmen's community knew the Knights intended to murder Lavenois, and through channels white authorities had never understood, and never would, a message was carried to the hotel, to room 7, where a widow in mourning clothes sat at a small desk, writing in her leather journal. Celeste read the message, a single line on brown paper, and smiled. She had expected this. She had, in fact, counted on it. Because the thing about rage, about the need for revenge, was that it made people entirely predictable. The Knights believed they were hunting her. They had failed to grasp a truth that had been present from the very beginning. She had been hunting them from the moment she arrived, and the hunt was far from finished. She packed her few belongings into her trunk, settled her account with the hotel desk clerk by mid-morning, and told him she had received word of business requiring her return to New Orleans. She thanked him for his hospitality, arranged for her trunk to be taken to the steamboat dock, and by noon Celeste Dufresne had departed Brobridge, boarding a southbound steamboat. The Knights, upon learning of her departure that evening, felt a complicated mixture of relief and frustration. She had escaped, but at least she was gone. At least the killing would stop. At least the killing would stop. They had no way of knowing that the woman on that steamboat was not Celeste at all. It was a freed woman named Charlotte, who bore a passing resemblance and wore borrowed clothes beneath a heavy veil. They had no way of knowing that the real Celeste had never left the parish, that she had moved instead into the colored section of town, into a small house behind the Freedmen's Church, where she was welcomed as a sister, an avenger, the instrument of a justice the law had perpetually denied. And they had no way of knowing that the murders, far from ending, were about to accelerate. Eugène Fontenot died on September 3rd, not in his bed, but on the road between his dry goods store and his home. He was found in his wagon at dawn, throat-cut, his horse grazing peacefully at the roadside. The placement of the body suggested he had been traveling with a companion, someone he had trusted enough to allow beside him in the dark. The note pinned to his chest read, "Remember the Fontenot store fire. In November of 1869, 3 freed men had attempted to open a competing general store in Bray Bridge, offering credit to colored customers that Fontenot's establishment refused. Within a week, the new store had burned to the ground. The 3 men had fled the parish, taking their families with them. No investigation had ever been conducted. Everyone in the parish knew who had given the order. Now everyone understood the price of that knowledge. Philippe Rousseau, the banker, died on September 15th, discovered when his clerks arrived in the morning. He had been killed at his own desk, apparently while working late on accounts, his throat cut with such force that blood had sprayed across the ledgers he'd been reviewing. The note referenced a loan he had foreclosed in 1870, driving a freedman farmer into destitution and homelessness, a foreclosure that violated the bank's own policies but had been approved without hesitation because the debtor was colored. 5 men dead in 2 months. The pattern was impossible to deny now, not only for the knights, but for the entire parish. Someone was methodically executing the most powerful men in St. Martin Parish, men who had considered themselves permanently beyond reach, shielded by their positions and their brotherhood. And somehow, despite all their precautions, the guards, the locked doors, the loaded weapons, the killer kept finding a way through. The federal authorities, who had largely stepped back from local affairs since the early days of Reconstruction, could no longer ignore what was happening. A U.S. Marshal arrived from Baton Rouge with instructions to investigate the killings and determine whether they constituted an organized attack on civilian government requiring military intervention. The Marshal, a severe man named Holbrook, who had fought for the Union and carried no sympathy for former Confederates, began his inquiry by questioning the surviving knights. What he found unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. The victims were all members of the same organization. All had participated in documented violence against freedmen. All had been killed in a manner suggesting intimate access and deeply personal motives. The notes left on the bodies referenced specific crimes that federal investigators had previously tried and failed to prosecute due to intimidated witnesses and corrupt local courts. Marshal Holbrook interviewed dozens of people, white and colored, men and women, longtime residents and recent arrivals. He examined crime scenes, reviewed coroner's reports, studied the pattern of attacks, and gradually assembled the story of Celeste Dufresne, the mysterious widow who had seduced and killed at least 3 of the victims, possibly all 5. But when he moved to locate her, she had vanished. The steamboat manifest showed a heavily veiled woman matching her description had departed for New Orleans, but authorities there had no record of her arrival. She had simply ceased to exist, as though she had never been real at all. Then Holbrook did something unusual. He began interviewing members of the freedmen's community, not as suspects but as witnesses. He spoke with church elders, with women who ran boarding houses, with men who worked as laborers and craftsmen. He made clear that he was interested in justice, not in protecting white criminals. And gradually, people began to talk. They told him about L'Ave Noire,